Um, why do you care so much about this ministry?
I've always loved missions, even since I was a little kid, and grew up in churches that were, always focused on missions-hearted churches, and even as an adult pastor, churches I was a part of were always engaged in missions. So Lynn and I, always had a heart for that. And so, first time I came here, though, I think that's when really God did something in me. I came to Ethiopia, went to a town called Asosa where we were working, and my first thought was, what in the world am I doing here? It was a ugly, poor, dirty town, and I thought, this is the last place in the world I want to be. So I was there for about 10 days, and by the time I left, I realized that God had just dislocated my heart for Ethiopia, and He had put a great love in my spirit for Ethiopians and for Africa, and just everything began to converge, and God began to pour into me the values that we now operate by in the Petros Network. And at the top of the list is just church planting. So I think it was a work of God. I don't think it was me. It's been there as a part of my spiritual DNA, but I think God just literally reached down and took my heart and put it on the other side of my chest. And I have been in love with Africa, Ethiopians, unreached people, and planting churches since then, about 11, 12 years ago now.
Tell me about Charles Blair.
Charles Blair was a well-known pastor in the 40s, 50s, 60s, probably one of the premier pastors in America. Grew a church from just dozens of people to multiple thousands before there was a mega church movement in America. Pioneered TV ministry in the Rocky Mountain Empire, and he was a guy that was way ahead of his time. Built a great church in Denver, Calvary Temple. And I knew of him as a little kid. My dad was a pastor who talked about Charles Blair, so he was kind of one of the pastors that other pastors looked to, for inspiration and organization and how he did it. And so I always knew of Charles Blair since I was a little kid. And when I was in school, Bible school, undergraduate school, Charles came and did a week long of spiritual emphasis at our school. And I remember listening to this guy, just amazed at his ability to communicate, the things that he had done with his church, just his story. And I remember saying to Linda, my wife, I said, if I were to ever work in a church, and I didn't sense I was being called to be a pastor at that time, but I said, if I ever worked in a church, I would want to work for Charles Blair. Well, lo and behold, we get our degree, get out of school, and I start working in a church. And after about 7 years in that church, the pastor retired, and so I was going to move on. And Charles Blair called me and asked me to come back and be his executive pastor. So a dream that I had, a desire I had way back in college got fulfilled when I got to work for Charles Blair. So I worked for him for 8 years and just became dear friends with him. He kind of took me under his wings. He became my spiritual father, my pastoral mentor, and just a close friend. So after I left Calvary Temple and moved back to Oregon, where we were from, pastoring there, Charles and I still stayed in contact. We were on the phone once a week and just, friendship. And then I left Portland and moved to California to become a senior pastor of a church there. And then Charles and I really got reconnected, and I brought him out to speak, and I went back into Denver and was served on his foundation board. He was starting to plant churches at the time. He was no longer a pastor. So we just got closer and closer. The older I got and the older he got, we just became very much connected in relationship. And so Charles, back in the early 90s, after the communist government fell here in Ethiopia, somehow there was I know what it was. The Ethiopian connection was really kind of a God thing for us. When I was still at Calvary Temple, we had some Ethiopian executives that worked at Compassion International, Colorado Springs. They came up one day and said, we want to meet with you. So Charles and I met with them. And they said, we have 4,000 Ethiopian expats in Denver, and we want to start a church for them. Could we use your church? Would you host this church? Yeah, and so we liked them. We just had this immediate connection, and we said, sure, why not? Because we had a tradition of hosting other ethnic churches within our church. And so we said, sure, why not? Well, these guys were different, though, these Ethiopians. They wanted to be a part of us. They didn't just want a building a room to rent. They wanted to be a part of our fellowship. So these Ethiopians started the church and started growing. There were probably 75, 100 of them. And they wanted to become members of our church. They wanted to have baptisms with us. They wanted their kids to be mainstreamed in our Sunday school. They wanted to be a part of us. They put on dinners for us. We'd eat Ethiopian food. They still were uniquely Ethiopian because they didn't have, they spoke in Amharic and they had their own services. But they were just different. They were a part of our DNA, and we became a part of theirs. So when the communist government fell here, through that connection, they began to invite Charles to come over to Ethiopia to do leadership development, because most of the pastors had been imprisoned, had been killed, had fled. And so there was a real lack of spiritual leadership in Ethiopia. So as the church came out of communist rule, the real need was pastoral development. So Charles began to come over to do seminars, training, and to develop these pastors. That ultimately led to him finding sponsorships for 300 of those to go out and to start churches. And in those original 300 were a couple of key guys for us: Eliud, Bekele, and Eliud's wife, Yegela. They were 3 of those church planters that originally went out under the Blair Foundation. So that kind of got started, and fast forward about 6 years from then, I was now pastoring a church in the Bay Area. Charles had retired from Calvary Temple. He's 84 years old, and he's still traveling to Ethiopia doing training. Well, he'd been in Ethiopia, and the president of one of the 9 federal regions of Ethiopia, the far western, remote, primitive region, was a Christian. He was an evangelical Christian, the only one in the federal government, and he was a fairly young guy, and he said, I need to use my position to further the gospel, and I want to win my region to Jesus, and I think the way to do that is to plant churches. There are 3,000 villages in my region, and if I could get someone to help me plant 1,000 churches in 1,000 villages, those 1,000 churches would reach the other 2,000, and my region would belong to Jesus Christ. And so this president went from organization to denomination to organization to person, and no one would help him. They said, great idea, we don't have the resources to do that. Somehow he made a connection with Charles Blair, the Blair Foundation. So Charles met with this guy, and he said, would you plant 1,000 churches in my region? And Charles says, yeah. So Charles gets on the plane, he's flying back home, and it suddenly hits him. I'm retired, I'm 84, I don't have resources. What did I just agree to? And so he started to handwrite a letter at 35,000 feet in the air to the president, and he was explaining all of the reasons why he couldn't help him after all. And as he's writing these letters, he said these reasons in this letter, he said the Lord spoke to him and said, Charles, I didn't ask you what you don't have. What do you have? That's what I'm going to use. What do you have? And Charles said, Lord, all I got now is friends. And the Lord said, good, tell your friends and watch what I do. So Charles flies home, gets off the plane. He calls me up. And I'll never forget the day. I'm sitting in my office in California, the Bay Area, get a call from Charles. We start talking, and he's so excited. He's just bubbly. He's like a schoolgirl, and he says, man, we're going to plant these 1,000 churches and in this region, and here's the plan I'm thinking about, and he's just going on and on and on. And he says, so what do you think of that? And I'm thinking, sheesh, you're 84 years old. You ought to take a nap or something. I thought, man, he's so thrilled. He's so, this is just giving him energy. Why not? And I said, man, I think that's a great idea. You ought to go for it. And then he says, okay, so will you help me with that? And I kind of felt trapped after I just encouraged him to go for it. And I said, yeah, I'll help you. So, we gathered 100 pastors from America, around the nation, and gathered them in Ethiopia. We gathered them in Denver. And we kind of laid out this plan of this is the region, this is the plan, this is how we're going to do it, this is what the cost per church is. And we're going on and on and on, just kind of building this thing up. And we did the same thing to them that he did to me. We said, you think this is a good idea? And they all went, yeah, you should go for it. And then we said, so will you help us? And so I think most of those 100 pastors committed to planting churches. I myself agreed to plant 5 of them. They were $1,850 a piece to plant a church, support the pastor, do benevolence, buy Bibles, training, all that kind of stuff. And in my church in California, we were up to here with missions already, and I thought, man, it's going to take about $10,000 to do 5. I'm not sure we can do it, but I just kind of felt like we needed to take a step and try to plant churches. And so I came back to my church, my board. I said, man, does this sound like a good idea? They said, yeah. And so I went to the church and I said, I want you to pray about this. I don't want you just to give to it right now because you're going to be excited, because I'm excited. Because if you give to this, it's got to be above your offerings, your tithe. It's got to be above your missions offerings. Because if you rob Peter to pay Paul, I'm going to be in trouble. So if God speaks to you, then you do this. You help sponsor these churches. If he doesn't speak to you, don't do it. You're off the hook. There'll be something else down the road I'll ask you for, but don't do it unless you hear from God. So I made my church pray for it for a month. Well, during that month, knowing that the Commitment Sunday's coming, I'm starting to stress about everything. I'm thinking, I know what people are going to do. They're going to take out of their tithe and they're going to do this, or they're going to take away from missions and they're going to pay for this, and I'm going to have a problem. And so I'm just fretting about the money issue, where it's going to come from and what's going to happen. And God spoke to me. I mean, just this internal voice prompting. It was so strong I couldn't deny it. And as I'm fretting about this, the Lord spoke to me one day and he said, Ray, if you will take care of the things I care about lost people. I'll take care of the things you care about. And I went, you got a deal, God. And so that Commitment Sunday, I had people sign a card, pray about it, walk their commitment to the altar, and I'm thinking, I might be the only one that really cares enough about this to do it, so I don't know what's going to happen. But I asked people to come and bring their commitment cards. So I had faith for 5. Our church in California, at the end of the day, gave enough money, made enough commitments to plant 131 of those 1,000 churches. So I knew we were onto something that was of God at that point. And it dramatically changed my life and our church. Our church suddenly became a missional church. We were focused on the Missio Dei, the mission of God to reach unreached people. And all the other issues and challenges became secondary. I mean, they became way down the list, and we were focused on changing the world. The interesting thing that happened there is the month that we made those commitments, those 131 churches, our tithe jumped 30%. Now, that's unheard of. I mean, you might increase 10% in a year. That would be a great year. We jumped 30% that very month. And it stayed that way. It didn't drop back down. It jumped. The Lord said, I'll take care of the things you care about if you take care of the things I care about. And he was just proving that that's the way he operates. Our missions giving, I mean, it increased 200% that year. The next year it was 150%.
On top of Ethiopia churches.
On 100%, 50. I mean, we were always, every year we were growing in our missions giving. So, the word of the Lord was true, that, the more we give away to his work, the more he gives us to give away. And as we give it away, he gives us more. So it's this cycle of generosity, cycle of blessing that we came into. So that really kind of reshaped the way I think about church and about missions and about just, walking in faith with God. Well, fast forward a few years, I'm now leaving that church to come back to the church I had been an executive pastor in Portland. They had been recruiting us, and we didn't think we'd ever leave California, but this church had kind of been after us for about a year. They had their senior pastor had left, and they wanted us to come back. And at the end of the day, we felt like the Lord had told us to go back. But I said this: I have this church planting thing, and I have this stuff in Ethiopia. So if we leave California to come to Oregon, this comes with us. At this point, Dr. Blair had become sick, and I was kind of running the organization. And so the church in Portland said, yeah, we know about that. We've been watching that, and we want that for us too. So we come to Portland, and about a year into it, I know it's time to plant some more churches in Ethiopia, to go to a different region and plant some more churches. So this time I have a little more faith, and instead of 5, I'm saying, let's do 250. And that's going to be a real stretch. To do that, and it's the same situation. We're already up to here in missions. Our budget's challenged, tight as it is. But now I know that what God had already promised me, that if we'll take care of what he cares about, he'll take care of us. So I did the same thing with my board, and I had them pray about it. They said, yeah, we think we should do this. They said, I made my board pray about it for a month before we made the decision to plant these churches. And I said, I know you guys have seen what we've done. You believe in it already. You believe in me. And I think you're going to say yes to me, but don't. I want you to pray about it, because if we don't hear from God, we're not going to do this. So they went away for a month. And they came back, and I said, what did the Lord say to you? And they kind of, as one man said, not only should we do this, but we should do this unapologetically. We should do this 1,000% of our energy, our commitment. Let's do this. So, took it to the church. I asked them to do the same thing, pray about it for a month. Don't respond to it just because I'm excited about it, because it's got to be above and beyond what we're doing. And so, Commitment Sunday, I'm standing up there again going, what if nobody walks their cars down to the altar? You know, I'm going to look like a crazy man up here. So it's kind of that moment of doubt, and you're kind of wondering if this risk of faith was, you know, really God or just you. And so they began to walk their commitments down. And, you know, I had faith for 250. We planted 364. And again, I'm just going, God, your word is true. Your promise, you're faithful to your promises. So that really launched us into orbit in even a more dramatic way. And as a result of that, you know, I mean, our church is being blessed. Same thing. Our finances have been blessed as a church. Our church has become more missional than ever before. Our missions giving has been going up, up, up. You know, as a pastor, I you know, wanted to have a church that would give at least $1 million away for missions. I mean, we've been given $1 million. This last year, we gave $1.7 million away to missions. So it's just changed how we think about the world. We've become very, very missional church. So as a result of planting all those churches and the growth of the church here in Ethiopia and unreached villages, you know, other churches began to hear about it. And they said, we want to do this. We want to do what you're doing. And so we realized at that point, Linda and I, that we needed to form a church planting organization that would allow other churches to come into the vision and the calling that we have. So we launched 3 years ago the Petros Network. And the Petros Network simply allows churches, organizations, denominations to come under our wings as we go out to these unreached villages and regions or countries around the world. Here in Ethiopia, the growth has just been spectacular. In now the 4 years since we started this, and we've actually gone beyond Ethiopia. We now plant churches in South Sudan. We have 100 there. We planted churches in Uganda. We're looking at Brazil to do some things among unreached people there. In 4 years, we've grown to 1,100 churches, and we now have 200,000 converts. We count. I mean, these are not inflated numbers. Part of our deal is real accountability and transparency. So we literally have 200,000 people in these churches that have been converted out of darkness. And remember, we don't go to where the gospel has been preached already. We go to unreached dark villages. And we now have 200,000 disciples that are being made in these 1,100 churches. So it's been a movement. It's not a program. It's not a paradigm. I think that God has I our organization to create a movement, a church planting movement in the world that I think is unique. I haven't heard of anyone else doing exactly what we're doing, but it's pretty phenomenal what God's doing.
Awesome. That's a really complete story.
You want me to repeat that?
Yeah, I'm ready. I missed a lot of it. Just kidding. Okay, so I'm going to ask you this kind of backdoor question, because I don't think you'd give me an answer if I asked it front door.
Okay.
What has your wife given up for this ministry? And she's here, so this will be interesting.
You know, for us to do this, and we formed this organization, Petros, to do it, and 100% of the money that we've raised has gone to where we said it was going to go. It didn't stay in our pockets. I don't take a salary. We haven't hired staff. I mean, it's been literally, it goes to our organization, to these church planters here in Africa. Mm-hmm. So I have really stretched my staff. Our church staff has done this with me, above and beyond, volunteer. We have a pretty sizable church, very active, requires 100% of our effort. And to do Petros on top of that has been extra credit. It's been all volunteer. And so my staff has worked extra. And at the top of that heap is my wife, Linda, who's just a brilliant person, a great organizational business mind. who's really come alongside me to put the structure and the process to the Petros Network. And so she's kind of taken on the organizational side. I get to focus on vision and training and all of that. She has to do the 1,000,001 things underneath an organization to make it work, make it effective, to make it sustainable, reproducible. So she she works late into the night, many days. She works extra. She's on staff with us as a pastor over communications and spiritual formation, discipleship. Mm-hmm. And on top of all of that, in a sizable church, on top of all of that, she's taken on the role of vice president of our organization and really chief operations officer. So it's come probably as more of a sacrifice for her than even me.
Wow.
I'm kind of in the river of this, and it just flows from me, and she's had to kind of take all those disparate parts and put them all together into some sort of organization. So I mean, she's as passionate about it as I am. She's now taken on developing it just beyond church planning. She's taken on what we call the redemptive lift side of things, and part of that is to form a women's empowerment, widows empowerment, micro grant kind of ministry to help the poor people that we're working with, the poor widows especially. And she's really passionate about that. But it's come at a great cost to her. And I'm at a point where I realize I can't stretch my people much further. We have to grow our organization to allow us to go to the next levels of what we're doing. So that's a whole different aspect, a dimension that now we've got to work on. But I'm a guy that's always in the throes of a new vision. So, whenever they hear me coming down the hall at the office and I'm going, hey, I got this idea, they're going, oh no, what are we going to do now? But yeah, it's just, there was a great missionary in the 1800s. I think it might have been, what's his name? Name just slipped my mind. Henry Martin. And he was a great missionary to India, to Persia, and at the end of his life, as he was dying, I think it was him. Could have been Hudson Taylor, but he they're asking him about what he did, and he said, "It was no sacrifice." It's no sacrifice. And I'd give my life for this. And I think Linda would too. Your dad would too. We would lay down our lives for these people because they're the ones that set their sacrifice.
What do you need from people? If people want to pour into this, what would you want them to know are your needs?
We've got a great thing going on here. And I never want to reduce the work of the Spirit to a formula. It's not formulaic at all. But we figured out a way to plant churches. And we know how to plant churches that quickly become sustainable and reproducible. We know how to do it. I'm not bragging. I say that in humility because we stumbled into this. It wasn't our brilliance. We just went, wow, this stuff works. So we know how to do this. And so I know that for $2,100 in this part of the world, we can plant a church. I know that for $2,950, and those are real numbers that we use in various places in South Sudan and Eastern Ethiopia, we get planted churches.
How much for South Sudan?
A church, $2,950.
Okay.
So what I would say to people is, you give us your missions resources, and we'll change the world. We'll plant a church, and that church will quickly have hundreds of converts. And if we plant 1,000 churches in a region, that region will quickly, someday, surrender to Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. I've come to believe through this, we can change the world. If I have $300,000, I can plant 100 churches. If I have $3 million, I could plant, it just, the equation just goes up. And I would just say for someone who might be listening to this, if you want to make the best investment of your life, you will see so much return on missional investment in doing this that will be something that can never be taken away from you. There will be souls standing in eternity someday because of the investment you made. I believe that with all my heart. I've experienced that personally, and I just have seen that in what we do, that money equals souls. I mean, Jesus said that in one of his parables. He says, buy for yourself friends in this world so that they will welcome you. And he's talking about money, so that they will welcome you into the eternal kingdom. He's talking about missions investment. I'm convinced of it. I mean, because we know that the challenge around the world in missions is a resource challenge. Missionaries, agencies need resources, and so do we. And the more we have, the more we've been able to produce from it. And we have a track record to prove it. So, obviously we need prayer. We understand that. We need encouragement, support, all those expertise, doctors coming, builders coming, those kind of things. But we need resources because we can translate those resources into eternal souls.
Can you speak? I've heard you say a little bit about our role as Americans may be the fund source for these on the ground.
Yeah.
Anything more you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing that happens here. We bring teams over, and they hear all the stories of resurrections from the dead and signs and wonders and healings and deliverances and people that we bring always say, why can't we have this in America? We don't have this in America. Boy, I wish we had more faith for that. And I agree. I wish we saw it too. But that's the gift of the Africans, the Ethiopians, the other people we work with. They have simple faith, and God shows up and they see these kind of things. But they weren't doing this before we came. So we don't have that there, but they don't have what we have that we bring. And so it's been this amazing congruence, this confluence of their simple faith and our resources and our ability to train and organize and coming together, that this explosion, this spiritual explosion, this great awakening is happening here. So, I try not to feel bad about the gifts that we don't have, that they have. I mean, we have gifts that they wish they had. And so it's just kind of the body of Christ where all the parts work together. They're not independent. And this is a great example of that. So I think that's really been an eye-opener for me, that we're going to leverage our gifts to the best that we can. They'll leverage theirs, and together we'll have this, this catalytic moment where it creates this movement. And that's exactly what's happened.
All right. A little bit more internal facing now, just to get to know your heart more. See, you are
make
here.
me cry.
Yeah, that's what I'm going for, man.
Ross, this is cutting down to almost below 1. I don't know if that's time left, or
One
it's
o'clock?
part of one file can only get so much in one
Right.
file. So let me stop, record, and start it again. Okay.
Sure. Okay.
See,
Do we need a break and go introduce Ford, or they